Thank you, Provost, for your very kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for coming. So this is the first of 6 lectures that I'm going to be giving during the course of the academic year, with the overall title, The Mysteries of Reading and Writing. My first lecture is What is Reading? And what I'd like to do this evening is to pose a number of questions about reading and to attempt to answer some of them. I hope the answer to others will emerge in my subsequent lectures. That's the plan, anyway. Reading is something we rather take for granted once we've gained basic literacy. Obviously, our literary skills increase the more experienced we become as readers, but it's not a subject that we perhaps think very much about, unless we come to help someone else to gain literacy skills, so particularly children. And then I think we realise what a very complicated process it is, and also, to some extent, what a mysterious process it is. So what is reading? Is reading decoding, a visual decoding? Where are the limits of what we would call real reading as opposed to using the term reading as metaphor? So if you read the expression on someone's face, is that really metaphorical, or are we simply decoding the expression as we might decode letters and words? So are there limits that we should set? I mean, I was very struck in France, in Burgundy, this summer. I saw a signpost that said, Station de lecture du paysage, observation post for reading the landscape. And I thought, the French read the landscape. And so I naturally climbed a very long way up to see what this observation post was. And here it is, and it shows all the hills, it shows some of the history, some of the geology, and so on. It enables you to decode the landscape. And the French, anyway, see that as reading. Now, reading, like speech, is unique to the human species. But speech we acquire, we're genetically processed to acquire, and we just need to be in a linguistic environment and encouraged into conversation, linguistic exchange, to gain speech. But reading has to be taught. It has to be taught formally. And occasionally there have been some quite witty attempts to suggest that children could actually teach themselves to read. Don't know if you remember in Tarzan, King of the Jungle, the baby boy comes across a reading primer, and he talks about seeing all these little black insects on the page and recognizing patterns. And of course, the black insects are the letters of the words. And he begins to understand how the patterns fit together and so on, and apparently teaches himself to read, which of course is not possible. Another rather delightful account of someone apparently teaching themselves to read is Marcel Pagnol, French novelist, and some of you may know the films that his novels have been turned into. And one of them is La gloire de mon père, My Father's Glory. And there's this rather wonderful scene where the little boy has learnt to read. So just...
Vieux de Marseille.
Le beau Marseille.
Quand ma mère allait au marché, elle me laissait au passage dans la classe de mon père qui apprenait à lire à des gamins de 6 ou 7 ans.
Bien!
Je restais assis au fond, bien sage, et j'admirais la toute-puissance paternelle.
Bien!
Un beau matin,
Oh, mon beau Galama.
ma mère me déposa à ma place et sortit sans mot dire, tandis que mon père...
Non, c'est pas vrai.
Qu'est-ce que tu dis?
Maman ne m'a pas puni, tu n'as pas bien écrit.
Qui t'a dit qu'on t'avait puni?
C'est écrit là.
Voyons, mais... Tu sais lire?
Oui.
Voyons, mais... Eh bien, on lit?
La, ma, a, pu, ni, la, 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 petit garçon qui n'était pas sage. Ça veut dire que tu m'aimes bien.
So, of course, he'd been left at the back of the classroom and he had actually paid great attention to his father's teaching, and so his father had taught him to teach, but his father hadn't been aware of him in the back of the classroom. I'd like to tell a little story about reading, which again I think illustrates what a peculiar process it is. Imagine two boys in rural Greece, Dimitris and Gregoris. Dimitris comes from the city and he's learnt to read. Gregoris is still illiterate, but Gregoris knows the local dialect, which Dimitris doesn't know. And they're playing in the attic of Gregoris's house, and they come across a trunk. And in the trunk is a letter. And they egg each other on and persuade each other that the letter gives instructions as to where various valuables were hidden during the Second World War. And Demetrius looks at the letter, can't make head or tail of it because it's in the local dialect. And he passes it to Gregoris, who says, well, I don't know how to read. So Demetrius starts to sound the letters out, with Gregoris kind of guiding him and helping him a bit. And gradually, Demetrius has sounded out all the words in the letter, and Gregoris is then able to translate it into modern Greek. So who's read the letter? Can't be Demetrius, because he doesn't know the language that he's reading, and it can't be Gregoris because he's illiterate. So they must both, in effect, have collaborated in the reading process. Reading isn't just about sounding out letters. It's also about understanding that there are before and afters, that there are causes, there are consequences, all sorts of complicated things. And you have to have a certain competence in the language you're reading before you can make sense of your reading. So both Gregoris and Demetrius collaborate in the reading process. It's a tragedy that there are some 750 million adults who remain illiterate in the world. That's roughly a fifth of the adult population. So reading is something that still needs to be promoted. And I say it's a tragedy because I think reading is something which hugely facilitates our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world, and our enjoyment of things. Language is a slippery business, and language is always on the verge of slipping into ambiguity and becoming problematic for us. So even if we take quite simple language, or language that's supposed to be simple and clear, things can go wrong. So as an example of a text that's supposed to be very clear, take a recipe. Now obviously it's key that you have the right ingredients, it's key that you prepare them in the right way, it's key that you combine them in the correct way, it's key that you cook the whole thing in the right way, and so on. And if any of that goes wrong, then you may make an awful mess of the meal. But even recipe instructions can be ambiguous. So here we have presumably husband and wife, and she has toiled away to produce a lovely meal, but the recipe said stand for 5 minutes, and so he's standing there very obediently as the dish goes cold. Linguisticians enjoy making diagrams to explain how some of these jokes work, some of these linguistic jokes. Take this one, which is the generation gap. So in this one, she's saying, "Did you notice our waitress's nose ring?" And he says, no, I didn't. Must not have been that loud. Now, you can represent this joke as complicated linguistic diagrams. I'm not strictly speaking in linguistics. So here we have subject, noun, phrase, pronoun. So all this is building, this is obviously what's said. It's in the affirmative in this example. So then we've got pronoun, auxiliary, verb. This is the verb phrase coming off here. The second noun phrase. So the first noun phrase is did you notice? The second noun phrase is the waitress's nose ring. Then we have a determiner. These are both counted as adjectives because they're both qualifying the ring. It's both the waitress's ring and it's a nose ring. Yeah. So that's what she was trying to say. Did you see the ring in her nose? And this is what he understood her to be saying. So here you have, starts off the same. This is the verb phrase 1 leading to the main verb, which is notice. Here you have the second part of the expression. But this is the crucial part where things have gone wrong, because here the nose has become a noun as opposed to an adjective qualifying the noun, and the ring, which was a noun, has become a verb. Did you hear her nose ring? So an awful lot of linguistic jokes can actually be turned into these sort of diagrams and explained in terms of the grammar of the language. Just a couple of other examples of you know what's coming, don't you? So, I mean, again, signage is supposed to be absolutely clear and basic. But I think probably quite a lot of children, when they're first able to read and see this, wait excitedly for the plant. And another one I quite like is diversion. Well, how often, if we're on a long car journey, how often would we actually like some diversion? But by and large, we don't get the diversion. We just have to go by another route. And then I was rather delighted to find, when I was thinking about these sorts of things, seeing the sign on the escalators in the underground that says dogs must be carried, I was rather delighted to come across this.
So they're not here? At the moment, people are not carrying dogs on the escalators. Madam, you're not carrying a dog on the escalator? It clearly says on the sign at the bottom, dogs must be carried, and too frequently people are not carrying dogs. Look all around you. As you can see, dogs can be carried like so.
Apparently all people must carry dogs. I never knew this.
So it costs you 12 pence to hire a dog, sir. It's fine, we have dogs available, and 4 pence extra as well for doggy travel insurance. Carry the dog. Please pick, sir, if you could pick the dog up, please. Dogs must be carried. Sir?
So even a quite simple language can end up ambiguous, but linguisticians, I think, would appeal to statistical likelihood that when we see heavy plant crossing, chances are that it's a crane or a digger and not a plant, similarly with diversion and dogs having to be carried. But if even the simplest language of recipes and of signs and so on can be misunderstood, then what happens when we read complex literary language, when we're up against all those aspects of rhetoric that make for forceful, interesting, ingenious language? How do we do it? How do we read it and get it right? One thing we have to be aware of is that the English language is a very idiomatic language, and we have to know that a lot of idioms aren't literal. And we have to assimilate a vast number of idioms. So take the expression bold as brass. If you're a native speaker, you see the expression bold as brass, and you know it means brazen, sticking up for what you believe in. But if you were a non-native speaker of the language, you'd say bold. Well, I know what bold means, but what's it got to do with brass? Brass is an alloy of zinc and, can someone help me out? Copper. So you might discover that and think, okay, well I still don't get it, bold as brass. Well, it turns out that it's all down to Brass Crosby. And this is in the 1770s. And so it's an expression which is really fundamental in some ways to our modern democracy. Because at that point in the 18th century, it was still against the law to publish parliamentary procedures. And a London printer thought, no, this isn't right. Everybody ought to have a right to know about parliamentary debate. And so he started to publish parliamentary proceedings. And he was arrested, and he was brought before a London magistrate, who happened to be Lord Mayor, so it's all quite close to home. And the magistrate was Brass Crosby. And Brass Crosby realised that public opinion was very much in favour of this, and himself believed it was right for parliamentary proceedings to be available to everyone, and let him off. And Brass Crosby was then himself arrested for treason, but such was the public outcry that he was allowed to go free, hence the expression bold as brass. Now, what happens with language is that, it's 3 words, and in it is a huge history and a wonderful story and something that really matters in terms of the history of British democracy. And yet it's a phrase most of us use without any idea as to what's there, the whole life that exists in those 3 words. And what happens to language is that it becomes cliched, it becomes fixed. And when that happens, we stop really being attentive to the words and sort of immediately decode it as what it means. So, as I say, instead of reading bold as brass and thinking about brass, we just think, oh yes, brazen. And the origin of the word cliché is an interesting one. It emerged in the 19th century when publishing and printing and literacy and all these things were really progressing at an enormous rate. And a cliché was, rather than the compositor putting each letter in one by one, any expression that occurred frequently was fixed into a slug of metal, which was called a cliché, so that when you wanted to compose bold as brass, instead of having to get each letter out, you could just take your cliché and drop it in. So it is sort of literally language when it becomes fixed, language when it's lost its life, and it just sits there and gets kind of slotted in. And I think one thing that writers are concerned to do, one of the many things that writers are concerned to do, is to revivify cliché. It's to take these sort of rigid, rigor mortis are sort of set into those words and try to bring them back to life again. And I think this is quite closely associated with what C.S. Lewis called verbicide, the murder of a word, the murder of a phrase. C.S. Lewis was talking more about words that had a life being used as though they were very simple words. So, awfully is one of the ones he particularly disliked for very. So, I'm awfully tired when you mean very tired, but actually awfully means full of awe, and it's a word that shouldn't have been murdered. It's a word that needs to be sort of rescued. He was rather given to exaggeration, and he thought verbicide would probably lead to the end of civilization, which is probably taking it a bit far. Now, one poet who is, I think, particularly concerned to counter cliché or acts of verbicide is Dylan Thomas, and he's a poet that I rather fell for very early in my life. And his poetry had a kind of magic. I had no idea why it worked a magic on me, but it really had a very powerful effect on me. I didn't know how interested he was in rhyme, internal rhyme, terminal rhyme, in rhythm, in trying to incorporate the rhythms of human speech into poetry. But all these things kind of washed over me and had their effect. even though I didn't really know how they were achieved. But I'd just like to consider two lines from his poem Fern Hill, which many of you will know, which is a poem that celebrates childhood and celebrates the immediacy of childhood experience, and the kind of rawness of childhood experience, and how it takes place in a kind of temporal zone, in a time zone, which is other from the time zone that we live in as adults. And two of the lines are, "And once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley." And I'd just like you to hear Thomas again. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but just hear him reading Fern Hill.
Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among wagons I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman, the calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely, the hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys. It was air and playing, lovely and watery, and fire green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars, as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the night jars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, and the farm like a wanderer white with the dew come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining, it was Adam and maiden, the sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house, under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long, in the sun born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house-high hay, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trades that time allows in all his tuneful turning, so few and such morning songs, before the children green and golden follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand in the moon that is always rising, nor that riding to sleep I should hear him fly with the high fields and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea.
I think there's a magic about Dylan Thomas reading his own poetry, and Another aspect of reading that we're perhaps not conscious of is that our oral experience affects our reading experience. And I think once you've heard Dylan Thomas reciting Fern Hill, you can't read the poem without hearing his voice. And therefore, reading is not something that is a purely visual process, that oral memory comes into it. His radio play... So one of the points I want to make about what he's doing there is he's saying once below a time. Now, he's taken once upon a time, which is certainly a cliche, and he's changed the preposition. That's all he's done. So once upon a time becomes once below a time. Not quite opposite, but close to opposite. And so when we read that phrase, there's all the reassurance of the childhood starting of a story, the once upon a time, but it's been changed in a way that makes us consider the words. And one thinks, well, why is it once upon a time? Why upon? How can something be upon a time? It can be at a time or before a time or within a time. But why upon a time? And it's actually an expression that was first coined in the 14th century. And by about 1660, it was well established as the opening to a children's story. So in a sense, what Dylan Thomas has done is he's brought back to life a phrase that has hundreds of years of history behind it, while at the same time suggesting that childhood experiences below time is somehow outside the superficial time, the real time of the adult world. And he does the same thing, really, with prepositions in his radio play Under Milk Wood. We all know of place names that are something upon something, something by something, something under something. I lived near Shipton under Wychwood as a child. And when I came to read Under Milk Wood, I thought, yes, but where under Milk Wood? It must be somewhere under Milk Wood. So here you have a sort of anonymous place under Milk Wood. And of course, Under Milk Wood is about our subconscious lives. It is about something that is below a time, in effect. Dylan Thomas played all sorts of other games. Are there any Welsh speakers here this evening? Because could somebody pronounce this for me in correct Welsh pronunciation? Thank you. Thank you. Now, some of you may also know that it was Dylan Thomas being a bit naughty, because it's basically bugger all backwards. But to a non-Welsh speaker, it looks fantastically Welsh. And this is where the action takes place. It's the little fishing village in Under Milk Wood. He wasn't the first to play this game. Samuel Butler wrote Erewhon in the 19th century, which is an anagram of nowhere. But Dylan Thomas gives it a nice twist by making it just slightly naughty. So I think much of what strikes us most forcibly when we read perhaps the very best language is, and what moves us most deeply, is language which has a certain kind of freshness. In other words, the obverse of the cliché. And this seems to be substantiated to some degree by recent work in neuroscience. Now, I have a friend who's a neuroscientist, and he says actually we're very much in the foothills in terms of understanding what's happening in the brain when we read. But there has been some very intriguing research done on metaphor and how the brain responds to metaphor. And it looks as though a very good metaphor, a very original metaphor, stimulates the brain far more than the cliched metaphor. So, for example, if you read the expression, he had leathery hands, the sensory part of the brain isn't stimulated, only the language part, because you're reading. But if you read something like a liquid chocolate voice, then parts of the brain that sense taste are actually stimulated. So it's as though the really good metaphors, the ones that are really arresting, aren't just words. The brain's not just recognizing them as words, it's recognizing as though you could actually smell liquid chocolate. And similarly, if you're reading an action-packed novel in which the hero is scaling walls and so on, parts of the brain that actually coordinate movement are stimulated. So it's almost as though with very powerful writing, although we know it's fiction, although we know it's not real life, I don't know how that happened, avert your eyes. It's as though we know it's not real, we know it's not real life, we know we're just reading about something, and yet our brain seems to be responding as though it was real life. Now, as I say, neuroscientists, I hope there are some neuroscientists here tonight, say we are very much at the very beginning of understanding what goes on when we read. But it is intriguing that there really should be a difference between the way the brain responds to language which is tired and dull and conventional and used, baggy, floppy on the page, as opposed to kind of vivid and vigorous and arresting when, the brain really lights up, as it were. So what exactly is going on? We know we're reading fiction, and yet the brain seems to think, in some ways, it's like real life. Well, Coleridge, the poet, had this wonderful expression where he said, when you read poetry, you suspend disbelief. You don't believe, but you suspend disbelief. And they're not quite the same thing. And it's an intriguing idea. And I wonder whether it's a little bit like when we watch a conjuring trick. So this is an old one, which some of you may know. And it's not a very feminist example, I apologize for that, but I just think it's an example that makes the point. So here is the lady lying in the box, so her head is on a pillow this end, and her feet are protruding that end. And then the conjurer has this marvelous saw, not just a hand saw, but a sort of enormous mechanized saw, and is going to saw her in half. Now, do we really think he's going to saw her in half? Because surely if we did, we would leap onto the stage and apprehend him. So we don't really think it's going on, and yet if it's a spectacle and exciting, isn't it? Because in some sense we think perhaps she is going to be cut in half. And does it make a difference if we know the trick? If we go back to it, is it sort of less exciting? It's a curious business. And I think this is, in many ways, analogous to what's going on when we're reading. We suspend disbelief. We sort of want to believe it's real. And a really good novel, you have to stop reading because you have to get on with life and your job. But you can almost feel as though life and your job is sort of less real than the novel that you're still thinking about and waiting desperately to get back to, because that's kind of real life, and you've just got to go through the motions of this other life before you go back to its reality. So very intriguing. I think one of the most moving descriptions of the transforming power of reading is in Alan Bennett's The Common Reader, which I'm sure some of you know. And it tells the story of Her Majesty the Queen becoming an avid reader. She's never really had time or opportunity to be a great reader. But her corgis disappear around the back of Buckingham Palace, and she chases after them. And they climb into a mobile library. So the mobile library is there for the staff of Buckingham Palace. So she follows them into the mobile library and then thinks it'd be awfully rude not to borrow a book after she's introduced herself to the rather flustered librarian in the mobile library who didn't expect the Queen suddenly to pop up. And so she sort of looks around. She doesn't really kind of know quite what to borrow because she hasn't had much opportunity to read. But she sees the names of one or two authors that she's given honours to and thinks it'd be quite interesting to read some of their stuff. Anyway, so she gets the reading habit and she gets it bad. And her private secretary is very bothered by this and feels that it might sort of destabilise things in some way. And he doesn't like the Queen withdrawing into her own space. You know, she is a public figure and should always sort of be out there. And the idea that she's withdrawing into fiction is something that he's a bit concerned about. And he also feels rather offended because he thinks, look, I brief you. Whenever you need to know about anything, I brief you. And so if you are giving honours to a writer, I'll find out enough about the writer to give you a briefing. And in a way, I think we live in a world of increasing briefings and summaries and sound bites and tweets and all these things. And the Queen has a rather wonderful retort to her private secretary. So she remonstrates with him and says, "Briefing is not reading. In fact, it is the antithesis of reading. Briefing is terse, factual, and to the point. Reading is untidy, discursive, and perpetually inviting. Briefing closes down a subject. Reading opens it up." So this evening, I hope I've raised a few questions about the nature of reading, about its complexities, about its mysteries, about what we do and don't really know about what's going on when we read. And I will continue with my theme of reading in subsequent lectures. But my second lecture is going to be really on the reader as opposed to reading. What do we understand a reader to be? To what extent can there be machines that read on our behalf? And I also want to look at images of readers. There are myriad images, particularly of women readers. And I want to ask, what do these representations of the reader tell us about the reading process? And what do they tell us about perceptions of the reader as an individual performing a particular act in a social setting? Because after all, if we have a painting of the reader, then the reader has been seen by the painter's eye, at least. So I hope you'll come to my next lecture, and I hope that you will just ponder these two images of readers that I want to talk about in my next lecture in November. This is Rembrandt's The Scholar. It's a 17th century painting, 1631 to be precise. And it shows the scholar with the light of wisdom and insight flooding onto his page, huge tomes open, and he's got a long beard which has long symbolized wisdom. And this one, which is by Théodore Roussel, which is from 1886. This painting is in our Tate here in London, so if you have time and the desire, you might want to go and see it in the flesh, so to speak. They're both paintings of readers, but I don't think they could be more different. Thank you. So if there are questions, I think there is a roving mic going around. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I was really interested when you were talking about metaphor and how it can make activate other parts of your brain. And one of the other sides of that may be for a reader, if there are too many metaphors, it can like hold you up in the reading process and kind of stop the flow. So I was just interested about the sort of conflicting role of metaphor in writing and whether that's anything you've thought about at all.
Well, I think that's a very perceptive point. I mean, I think that understanding metaphor is about decoding. And some metaphors require us to think much harder than others. And then I think if you stack them all up, the poor old brain struggles, quite simply. I think it's very difficult for writers, actually, to find that line between the metaphor that's almost impossible to understand and the metaphor that's just too obvious. It's got to be somewhere in between to be really striking, I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
Thank
you. Hi. I was wondering what the main subject of this was about good writing and bad writing, and what you think, or how that relates to an individual's personal subjective experience. So that maybe someone might be more inclined to enjoy writing that's rhythmical and has a certain oral quality, whereas others might, respond better to grandiose language or whatever. And yeah, so how in general, with regards to neuroscience and the different sections of the brain, how you would respond to that?
Well, that's a very big question, and you're right, I'm on thin ice, because obviously reading is a hugely subjective experience, and I think we all know that from the experience of rereading, which is something that I want to talk about in later lectures, that I'm sure you've had the experience of reading something that you read first in childhood, and you think, well, it's not the same work, it's changed. But of course you've changed, and so what you engage with changes, and it's almost like the foreground and background of a painting, that what you remembered as the foreground seems to have withdrawn into the background, and vice versa. So reading isn't stable in any sense, and our individual engagement with the text, with a novel, can change over time. And so it's extremely difficult to generalize about good or bad writing. But I do think it's quite interesting that what most of us, I think, would recognize as powerful writing does seem to stimulate the brain much more than what most of us would consider to be dull writing. And I think what I'm saying about cliché is not that it's bad writing, but the words just don't seem to have to work very hard, because we don't even really see the words. We only see the expression bold as brass. So in that sense, I think that must be language working less vivaciously than in an expression that's new and striking. I don't think I've entirely answered your question. I hope I've answered part of it.
I mean, I was wondering more on a basic level, with regard to pure sound and rhythm, as opposed to a meta idea like a cliché. Right.
Okay. No, I think we are just different. I think some of us pick up different aspects in a poem. Some of us, might particularly like internal rhyme and be aware of that and conscious of it, and other people other aspects. Maybe one of the wonderful things about a really good piece of writing is that different people can engage with it in so many different ways, whereas a recipe we all have to engage with more or less in the same way. And as language gets more complex, and I would say more literary, you could say at one end of the spectrum you have washing machine instructions, and if it says put the soap in such and such a container, if you get that wrong, then the clothes aren't going to get washed. So that's language where it has to have a really simple one-to-one relationship with the world. So when it says put the soap in the dispenser, you have to know what the dispenser is to put the soap in. And you could say at the other end of the spectrum is the most sort of complex literary language, where we all engage with it in slightly different ways. And even as individuals, if we read in a different mood or in a different place or at a different stage in our lives, we engage with it differently.
Thank you. I think you may partly have answered this question, but most of your examples have been, and your discussion has been about literary language and fiction, and poetry and so on. And I was wondering whether you felt that the way in which we read is also affected by the purpose for which we read, and therefore often reading non-fiction has a different purpose than reading a fiction. Do you think there's a material difference between the two?
I do, but I think I would say that if we're reading history, for example, then there's probably less room to engage with it in a way that's different from some other reader. I think the historian's task is to write with a kind of accuracy and crispness that means that most readers engage with it largely in the same way. That's not to say that you might find some aspects of the history more interesting than others, because it might pertain more closely to parts of your life. But I think the language is probably working in a less complex way, by and large, in something like history. But yes, I think the reason why we're reading something has a huge effect on the way we read. If we're reading to find things out, or if we're reading to escape, or if we're reading to have ideas, or if we're reading to understand other lives, all those things make a difference. Just as the dust jacket makes a difference in terms of the expectations it sets up. So I think all sorts of things are involved there, absolutely.
Thanks. I'd like to ask about when the emotions are aroused by reading, with the extreme example of erotica. But I'm not really talking about erotica, because is there a difference in the brain when one is reading polemical writing, say, or rabble-rousing writing, when you are expected to respond emotionally and leave your rationality behind?
Well, so far the only research I've read about is really to do with sensory experience and physical experience. I don't know if any work has been done on what's happening in the brain in terms of emotion and whether one's actually moved in the same way. I mean, what I do know, and which I find absolutely fascinating, is that our emotional response to reading has changed considerably over time, and I'll be talking about this in a subsequent lecture. And so, I mean, in the 18th century, a lot of people did weep when they read novels. Not only did they weep, but women particularly, if they read in groups out loud, which of course went on a good deal, women would express anxiety in their diaries about, what if I don't weep when all the other women weep? Then I will look so callous and as though I don't have the sensibility I should have, which I find fascinating. I think there's a gentleman at the front here. Thank you.
I've noticed over the last year or two an increasing number of talking books have a synthetic voice. And I went to an exhibition on Saturday morning, and there were at least 3 machines there that you could put a book or a newspaper or a magazine in, and it read it. One of them even put it on a gadget you could put in your pocket and play it any time to you. Now, if you have an artificial voice, is that going to alter the way in which people write? Or will writing disappear?
I don't know that it'll have either effect. I mean, I'm sure it makes it a less pleasurable experience for the listener if it's an artificial voice. I mean, I think reading out loud, I don't think it's dead, humans reading to each other. And I think there are lots of promising signs. I mean, the number of people who go to literary festivals now, for example, is extraordinary. And that's to hear, real people speaking, real people reading their work. So, you could say, well, what's the point in coming to a lecture tonight if you can watch it on the podcast? Well, I think there is a reason for us being here and being able to engage directly. And so for all the technology, I'm not sure that some of the more established ways of going about reading and writing and reading to each other and things are going to die out. In fact, I think there are quite a lot of storytelling clubs that are actually, on the increase at the moment. So I think for all the technology, there's always going to be a sort of counterbalance.
Do you think there's a different process that our brains go through when we read in a foreign language? So if we're bilingual or trilingual, how does the sort of interconnect? How do the interconnections work?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things about that, and an awful lot of modern writers are at least bilingual, if not trilingual. I think it was Hemingway who wasn't bilingual, but Hemingway said, "When I write, I use every word as though I'm reading it for the first time." And as a writer, you have to have that attention to every single word. And I think if you're bilingual, when you read the idiom, when you read Boulder's Brass, you read both the idiom and the words. And I think somebody like Samuel Beckett, who wrote in both languages, he particularly enjoyed writing in French because he said he was just attentive to every word on the page in a way that he found it very difficult to be with his own language because it sort of runs away with you. Whereas if you're working in a foreign language, you're much more focused on the individual words and how they work. So I think there are big differences, and I think it is very interesting when one comes to think about just how many modern novelists are, as I say, at least bilingual.
Oh, I was actually thinking of I am reading a book in French.
Yeah.
How is that as a process different from reading a book in English? Obviously it's easier in English and quicker, but I
think it makes you much more attentive to the nuts and bolts of the language.
Specifically that as opposed to any other neurological process.
I mean, I'm sure there are different
Right,
neurological
okay.
things going on, but I'm not a neuroscientist. But I certainly do think you're much more attentive to the nuts and bolts and how the language works when you read a foreign language. For one thing, I think you always have to read slightly more slowly.
Right, no, excellent.
Thanks. I'd like to go back to metaphor, what you were talking about there, because I was extending it to thinking about crossword puzzles, cryptic crossword puzzles. You know, what work, if any, have you or anybody else done on looking at brains solving cryptic crossword puzzles? Because mine sort of goes blank, but I'm wondering if that's because so many things are firing, it hasn't a clue where to process anything, or whether, you know, what do you know about that, if anything?
I don't really know. I mean, I think what has to happen is the brain has to process endless possibilities until it comes up with the right one. And there are some very powerful computers now that are doing very, very well at crossword solving, and that's simply because they sift through every possible answer. And I suspect our brains are doing a similar thing. They're scanning through possibility until something fits. I only do the quick crosswords. So.
Hello. What are the key areas that you would like to see uncovered by neuroscience as it relates to reading? That's one question. And I also wondered about how important is experience, one's own experience when one's reading a novel, to add to one's enjoyment, or do you know about whether people also like to read books where they haven't had any experience of what is happening? Thank you.
Well, they're two very interesting questions. Can I take the second one first? I think there are quite interesting gender differences when it comes to choice of fiction, particularly. Some very, very big surveys have been done on reading preferences. And by and large, women seem to prefer fiction that is very much about direct human experience with which one can identify and feel emotionally bound up, and where the hero or heroine has trials and one feels for them and so on. Whereas by and large, men seem to prefer fiction that's more about ideas or philosophical conundrums. So there certainly seem to be some gender differences. And I think probably most of us read, I mean, you said, do we like reading about things that are familiar? Well, I think we probably do. And do we like reading about things that are unfamiliar? Well, I think in another mood, maybe we do. What can neuroscience tell us about reading? Well, my feeling is they'll never really crack it, because I just think it's too complicated an activity and too many different things come into it. And so I don't really see how you can really set up trials that would give you reliable results. I mean, as I say, I think we've all had the experience of rereading something that we've read earlier in life and really been astonished by it not being the same work at all. And so clearly we're capable of engaging, particularly with works of fiction, in very, very different ways according to circumstance, mood, age, maybe whether we've got indigestion. And so, you know, I think there are so many factors that I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, the other thing is that, you know, if you read Anna Karenina, if you read quite a long novel, I mean, are you going to expect someone to have wires hooked up to their brains while they read the entire work? Because after all, it is a work. The reading experience is a whole one. So, I mean, at the moment, getting people to read Leathery Hands and A Liquid Chocolate Voice, you know, I don't think it's got very much beyond that yet. I mean, I suppose I'd be pleased if neuroscientists could demonstrate the merits of novel reading, because then I think it would encourage even more novel reading. And I do think that novel reading expands our humanity and our understanding of other people, and therefore it should be encouraged.
Hello, I'm here slightly, or I want to make a little bit of a plug at this point, because I'm one of over 200 actors who work as actor readers in stroke recovery wards. Wow. In about 20 hospitals in London and outside London as well. And I think it's St Thomas's, but I'm not absolutely sure, where they have done research into the effect of our one-to-one bedside reading
Right.
in speeding up the process of recovery after stroke. And also, just for my own reasons, I'm quite interested in knowing what your thoughts are on why, when I say to somebody who may or may not be able to speak, but sometimes can give me indication through their eyes, why they say no very violently sometimes when I ask them if they like poetry. There's usually, it goes one way or the other, there's no grey area. Either it's yes, I love it, or no, I loathe it, or a violent shaking of the head. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. And just finally, before you say that, the actors learn to their words and their lines by engaging physically, obviously with language. And when we're taught to act, we are told language, we have muscle memories, you know, everything that we read and hear goes in as a neuromuscular file of some sort. Yeah. And I think the people who are doing the research into this stroke recovery reading have done a lot of thinking about this, so it might be worth talking to them, yeah. And by the way, we've had our funding cut and we can't read for the next 5 months, so interactreadingservice.co.uk or .org, I think it is. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure we all commend your work. Point about the novel and poetry. Well, obviously, teaching modern languages as I do, I have the same problem, that most of my students want to read novels and are much more anxious about reading poetry, particularly in a foreign language. And I blame the schools. I don't think enough poetry reading goes on in schools. And I also think there are misconceptions about what's going on when you read poetry. I mean, you don't have to sort of understand it in the way that a lot of people think it has to be understood. You can enjoy it in all sorts of ways. It's not a crossword that has to be kind of solved. It's its own complex kind of language, and you just have to engage with that complexity rather than feeling I ought to be able to sort of rewrite this as prose. I haven't got it because I can't sort of give a prose equivalent. So I think poetry needs to be taught differently. I'm surprised that all your clients, not all, okay. Okay. Well, they're different experiences, aren't they? And no doubt in reading fiction, some people may find it much more easy to escape into a fictional world than they do into the world that's created by a poem. And of course, I mean, there are very different kinds of, I mean, you know, some long narrative poems I think one can escape into just as easily as a philosophical novel. So.
I'm fascinated by why some clichés seem to stick, although they are astonishingly meaningless. My particular unfavourite is the job advertisement. The candidate must have a proven track record of selling widgets on a Wednesday. Now, to my mind, if they've got a record, it doesn't have to be proved. And Mo Farah has a track record. Most of us don't have a track record. We just have records. Why do these things stick?
Because we're unimaginative, I suppose. But I mean, as I say, I think part of the job of the writer is to purify the language. I mean, Mallarmé said to purify the language of the tribe, that what writers are doing is countering that kind of lazy, lifeless language. And what you've done is to draw our attention to something, so I'm sure that when we next read that cliché, you'll have partially revivified it for us.
Looking at this image, I was wondering if you've done any research on the physical adoption one can take when one's reading, because I was thinking about people praying. Like in medieval images, you get perhaps somebody praying at a prie-dieu and reading their book of hours. And I'm wondering if any research, or whether you've done any research on how that affects one's reading, the physical attitude one takes, like that lovely lady there.
I don't know if there's been any research done. I mean, certainly we do know that it's most likely that in the classical world, it was only at a certain point that people started to read silently, probably around the time of St. Augustine, although it's quite contested. But it seems as though, for a very long time, all reading was actually the sounding out of the letters, partly because punctuation hadn't developed, and so it was actually quite difficult to understand it unless you sort of read it out. So there's a difference between that kind of reading and the silent reading that goes on, particularly in the religious context. And I think, I mean, certainly in religious orders, there used to be reading during meal times, and the idea was that would prevent people from, you know, having thoughts straying from the contemplative and the religious. So I think context is one very important aspect of how we engage. And in some of the images we'll be looking at, place matters very much. I mean, the beach obviously is a great favourite as the setting for certain kinds of women's reading. So yes, I think our attitude in terms of place, in terms of our bodily position, whether we're kneeling, whether we're reclining, again, I think they all do come into it. And I mean, some really interesting scientific research about this is that apparently you don't concentrate so well if you sit on a comfortable seat when you read. You actually you concentrate better if you're on a hard surface. And one theory is that it's actually helpful for concentration for part of the brain to be saying, don't think about the fact that this is a hard seat I'm sitting on. that actually helps. Whereas if you're in a nice comfy seat, the brain hasn't got anything to sort of keep out of the way, which helps with the focus.
Belinda has demonstrated that we made the right choice. And I look forward very much to the rest of her lecture series and to the questions which obviously they will stimulate as have been stimulated today. So thank you very much indeed.